So let's get into this. Okay, so this is a completely unexpected mini draft kingdom. We're only doing this because Fnatic's draft was so bizarre and it makes no sense. So this was day 3 of the opening week of LEC. This is Fnatic versus Vitality. Now, one of the things that I'm going to say right immediately out the gate is that some of the bans by them don't really make any sense. Unless they think that, you know, they would last pick Annie or even like flex pick Annie, etc. Because I think there's a lot of power picks. I think that some of the bans by Red Side here, or the only thing that I would say is not super great, is probably the Aurelion Soul. I think that Varus is really flexible. I think that Caitlyn is also, you know, answerable, but again, you'd have to play like certain things to answer Caitlyn and end up nullifying her, and I just don't think that that really plays to like maybe what Vitality wants to do. Like for instance, like B1 Caitlyn, I think instantly loses to R1, R2 Lux Seraphine, with Seraphine retaining flex into mid lane. But obviously, we're not going to get stuff like that out of Vitality, so it doesn't matter. Okay, so the Caitlyn's banned away. Okay, so Fnatic open with B1 Ashe. So B1 Ashe, Ashe has a theme. Ashe has poke, and she has pick. Those are her 2 archetypes. And again, if we were using like MTG terminologies, those would be her 2 colors, or her true like themes of like what she's trying to do, whatever. Now, the really bizarre thing is that the opponents, aka Vitality, they respond with Gragas and Xayah. These are 2 champions that are really known for their disengage ability. Xayah is also known as a vacuum answer to, obviously, Ashe, right? In the sense that Xayah can just dodge her ultimate. Xayah, especially with her range inside of laning phase, the way that Xayah can actually lane, it's relatively good. And even if Ashe ends up going support, so that Ashe's ultimate is up more frequently than Xayah's ultimate, it's still the main point does end up remaining unless you're going to do like really advanced dances and whatnot. Okay, so now Vitality has now drafted 2 disengaged champions, 2 champions that flourish at getting dove into and doing disengage, right? That is what these 2 champions really, really, really like. Whether or not they can do other things, like typically sometimes Gragas is used as an engaged champion, sometimes historically been coupled with like Nocturne and these other types of things. Normally, he's really known for his disruption and his disengage, and he's known for just being very solid. He's able to go into multiple different roles, and that makes him very difficult to draft against when he's picked early. He can go jungle, he can go mid, he can go top lane, and he can be a neutralizer. And so that's really good. So now knowing this, you would think that Vitality, or not Vitality, Fnatic, Ashe has the poke. She has the long range. You might think that, well, okay, what does Xayah really hate playing against? Xayah really hates playing against poke and long range, if that is the entire theme of the team composition, right? So what does Vitality, or what does Fnatic end up doing? Well, they end up going Vi and they go Zeri. Okay, so immediately now make up your mind. Are you trying to hard engage and have a pick composition with your Ashe and your Vi, or are you trying to scale? Because if you're trying to scale, the Zeri pick makes sense. If you're trying to have a pick composition, the Ashe and the Vi make sense, at least in their own world. However, it doesn't make any sense when you're staring down a Gragas and a Xayah. The Gragas and the Xayah already flourish at getting engaged on. They want to be engaged on because it activates their biggest strengths. It activates Xayah's ability to kite backwards. It activates the fact that she's going to root you with her abilities. It activates the fact that her ultimate then has increased value as the game continues to go on. So why did you just pick Vi when Jarvan exists as a pick and is able to do everything that Vi is able to do except do it better, and at least Jarvan's able to lock down Xayah? Doesn't make any sense. So now already we're seeing inconsistency in Fnatic's draft. Their champions are not agreeing with one another in draft. Their champions don't agree with what they're trying to do. And for anyone that uses the idea of bridging as a concept, it doesn't actually work the way that people, when they do draft analysis or talk about drafts and stuff like that, it doesn't actually properly translate. The idea that you should draft a non-congruent champion in order to achieve something or balance out a draft, it doesn't make sense when it's so far off theme. You can draft something that is still in the theme of what you're trying to do. Okay, so an example of this, right, would be like Victor is obviously known for his ability to be very good at disengage, but he's also known to be able to poke because he has his long-range laser. He's a very interesting and unique control mage, right? So he's able to fill into different types of archetypes. Now, if what they're trying to do is have a scaling AD carry that is also able to play with the poke and the pick or something like that, they could do something like Ezreal. Now, Ezreal typically still would not want to be accompanied with the Ashe and the Vi because because that is not a champion pairing that you would normally find with one another, but it would still be within the realm of consistency of what Fnatic would be trying to achieve. So it doesn't make any sense when the Zeri ends up getting picked. The R3, you already know that it's coming. It ends up being Rakan for Vitality. Okay, so you already knew that the Xayah Rakan was coming, and you opted into what you did anyway. So now you have a scalingless Zeri accompanied with two champions that are activating what the opponent's R1 and R2s are basically dreaming of. This would be like queuing up for an MTG Arena game, or maybe a Hearthstone game, or a Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Masters game, or a Pokemon Online game or something, in literally getting to play against the deck that you hard counter. It doesn't make any sense. It's even more so bizarre when League of Legends drafting is a face-up complete information game. The only way to deceive or hide any of your information is via flex picks. And that's why flex picks obviously hold a lot of value. That's why Gragas is very good. That's why Jarvan can be really good, because Jarvan's able to be multi-flex. That's why Karma historically has been very good in draft. It's why Jace has some value in draft. It's why champions like that can be very good. It's because League of Legends drafting is face-up. It's complete information. And the only way to kind of alter that is via flex picks. But even then, the flex pick is still known that it has the possibility to be a flex pick. On R4, Azir ends up getting picked. Now, this is still consistent. I don't like, obviously, the idea that Vitality go for Azir here. It is blind, and you know that Humanoid likes to play control versus control. But still, I didn't like it in that regard. However, it is still consistent. It is a champion that flourishes against getting engaged on. It is a champion that is anti-engage. It is a champion that can also be somewhat anti-pick in the sense that he can throw out his wall in the event that he's getting picked, and he can, potentially separate some of the opponents. So Vitality's draft is still really, really, really consistent. I was saying before the game that I wasn't going to launch any bets on the game because I thought that all the odds were so terrible. But by this stage of the draft is already so one-sided, and you can tell that Fnatic have no idea what they're actually doing in the draft phase, that it makes it glaringly obvious that the team doesn't even, they're not even aware of what's happening. Now, most teams in the world don't actually properly draft, and I constantly say this. People always show up to my stream, they'll show up in YouTube comment sections, they'll show up on Reddit threads, etc., and they'll say, well, what team does draft good? What team does draft good? And a lot of people will just think that the team that wins ends up drafting good. The reality is that if you go to any region right now, LCK, LPL, LEC, LCS, whatever, almost no teams are drafting in response to what the opponents are showing. This is why I arrive at the conclusion that no team is actually drafting. Now, you can arrive by having a winning draft regardless of your ability to assess what is happening inside of the draft, and then making adjustments or, doing certain champion picks in response to what you're seeing, etc. However, with what's going on right now, Vitality are hard winning the draft because Fnatic is inconsistent. So now, Fnatic, they completely blunder even harder. They end up going LeBlanc into the Azir, and then they go Ornn. So now it's make up your mind. Are you trying to scale, and that's why you have Zeri and Ornn, or are you trying to do some sort of early game shenanigans and have some sort of a weird pick comp, and that's why you have LeBlanc? Why are we blind picking the Ornn in top lane when already our bot lane is inconsistent and the Gragas is still a retained flex to some degree with mid or jungle and top lane? And then why do you have a LeBlanc in this team composition with two champions that actually hate her existence inside of the game? Nothing makes any sense whatsoever with Fnatic's draft. In a situation like this one, they should realistically just be looking for champions that are going to either pick or add something to the poke. Now, a champion that would do that without inducing any sort of magic resistance or something while playing against Xayah's theme would be Corki. And I know that a lot of people don't want to see that Corki is one of the better champions for what is going on, but unfortunately, Corki is the reality. Another champion that would still be consistent with what they're trying to do, but obviously you're never going to get it out of Humanoid, is going to be Akali. Because now Akali is going in with the Vi and with the Ashe and trying to do something. But again, even Akali wouldn't make any sense because they're showing you Gragas, they're showing you Xayah, they're showing you Rakan, they're showing you Azir. Now Akali is a vacuum answer to the Azir, ends up making sense. However, when you entertain the entire picture, the Akali still doesn't make sense. So you're left with a limited range of mid lane options. You need a champion that's able to do something against the four champions that Vitality end up having while still being being able to synergize or pair somewhat well with the champions that Fnatic has already picked. Now, you could do some weird things like Karthus mid lane or whatnot. At least that way you're able to offer the R and you're able to play something in mid. Or you could do something weird like Kossadin, but then if you're doing Kossadin, why do you have the champions that you have above? But again, it's in the same line of thought that, you know, what is there to really do? You could do like Twisted Fate, but the problem is that in the current dynamic of Twisted Fate versus Azir, Twisted Fate isn't going to be doing the type of things that he was once known to do, even though Twisted Fate does have some value, I think, currently in mid lane. Other types of champions that might be able to do this would be something like Yone, but again, you're running into Xayah. So you have a limited range of options. You could do something like Vel'Koz or Corki. I think that those are probably the two best champions that would be able to do anything in a situation like this. But you are really limited. Obviously, the LeBlanc, though, just makes literally no sense whatsoever. Another champion that maybe they could pick would be Ahri. There to follow up with the Vi and with the Ashe, Ahri not being banned away. You would be able to lane against the Azir, but again, you are running into Gragas, you're running into Xayah, you're running into Rakan. And that's why I think that realistically, one of the only options that you have available to you is probably Corki. Another champion that would maybe be available to them would be something like Veigar, but the thing is that when you have Veigar, you incentivize Merc Treads, and when you incentivize the Merc Treads, your Ashe also ends up getting hit as a byproduct of this. And then you also have an Ornn in top lane who will end up getting hit by some of the itemizations that the opponents can end up having. So even a champion like Veigar, who might end up being okay in a situation like this, is not really okay, but that doesn't mean that you necessarily had to go Ornn. You could easily go Veigar in a spot like this, and then you could change up your top laner, but I think that these are things that obviously are never crossing the mind of Fnatic whatsoever. So with that being said, Fnatic's draft makes no sense, pretty much across the entire board. It makes it very awkward, but you can just clearly tell that, you know, that they're not really thinking about what they're doing. If they do something like Veigar and then Gangplank on B4, B5, it begs the question of why did they end up B1ing, B2ing, you know, Ashe and Vi? Because the champion themes that end up beating these champions are nothing like what they draft in the early stages. Now, if Fnatic, for some reason, end up having something like this, you know, in response to what the opponents picked, well, now you have a very different makeup. So if you have Ziggs being retained as a flex into mid lane, you could also have Ziggs against Azir. The Jarvan is probably never going bot lane as support here, but he does retain the ability to go jungle and top lane. Very unlikely that Jarvan would obviously ever go mid because that's reserved right now for Ziggs, but you could get Ziggs AD carry. Ziggs would pair with Ashe in terms of his ability to poke inside of the laning phase, and then he's able to be left alone on an island and allow Ashe to basically go elsewhere or look for like the close range arrows on mid lane roams, etc. And then in the later stages of the game, Ziggs and Jarvan have a lot of synergy and a lot of follow-up. The archetype of these champions does somewhat better answer what exactly Vitality are doing, and maybe the Azir pick doesn't end up coming through because Ziggs is able to be flexed into mid lane. In the event that Ziggs would be flexed into mid lane, then you would end up, you know, getting your pick of the litter on ADCs that would look a lot better. Maybe you do something like Ezreal. Now at this point, you've now pivoted back to like a poke and like not really that much of a pick team composition, in which case your Jarvan is probably going to do things like R and then EQ out, rather than doing EQ into R and trying to trap the opponent and then, you know, bombard them that way. But at least that pivot would be a lot more consistent with like trying to play against what Vitality are drafting than anything that Fnatic was doing. But anyways, these types of thought processes aren't going to be getting entertained or thought about whatsoever by teams that are obviously playing. So it doesn't make any sense. But if I just put that out there for people wondering like what types of, you know, themes and picks could you end up doing in a situation like that. You could also do something unique like go Seraphine here, because Seraphine being able to pair with Ashe, the Ashe W into the Seraphine E is just a root, and then this allows you to have a lot more scaling. Seraphine is also a vacuum answer to the Gragas in the sense that Gragas hates playing against enchanters, because no matter how he ends up building, no build is actually suitable enough against most enchanter team compositions, and Seraphine scales a lot. So it would primarily be Seraphine AD carry with Ashe support, but you do retain the ability to have Seraphine end up going mid lane, and then you have Ashe AD carry, and you can wait and see how the draft ends up developing. But again, this requires you to utilize flex picks and requires you to acknowledge what the opponents are actually drafting, and then respond to it accordingly based on the desires of what the opponent's team composition needs, not what you want to do. But this type of drafting would require more thought processes. Now, obviously, if you have something like Seraphine Jarvan right here, again, you still have a lot of synergy. And this is a much better opening B1, B3 against the very obvious face-up R1, R3 of what Vitality was drafting. But the way that Fnatic's drafting just makes no sense across the board because it's just inconsistent. Sorry about that, moving the Olaf. It's just really inconsistent, and it doesn't make any sense because not only are they unironically picking a champion into a self-counter, they're also self-countering themselves team comp-wise, and their champions don't make any sense with one another. Either you're making picks, or you're scaling, or you're doing nothing. These champions also all spike at different points when you line up a lot of their gold costs and whatnot, and they're going to have very different strengths and timing, whereas the champions on the side of Vitality are going to have much more synergistic timings, and then obviously the R5 still doesn't exist. In a spot like this one, there's also still a lot of possibilities in top lane. Vitality ended up opting into Camille. I think that you could also end up going like Enchanters in top lane, and that would be just fine as well, because there's no way for these champions to end up doing anything. Karma's open. You could do probably something like Karma in top lane, and that would be fine, even though she doesn't deal damage. I don't think it would matter. You could do something like Roaming Janna top lane. You could even do something like Set would probably actually be okay as like a bodyguard, and I fucking hate Set, so you know that if I'm saying something like that, it would be all right. You could also do Mordekaiser in top lane, and even though you end up having triple magic damage topside, it's going to be impossible for a lot of these champions to end up getting magic resistance, with the exception of Vi. Zeri is never going to get magic resistance, neither is Ashe, and if LeBlanc is buying magic resistance in this game, then you've effectively rendered her useless inside of this game, because the whole purpose for her being picked was to be able to follow up on picks. And if she's going something like Mercury Treads, or getting Banshee's Veil, or end up going Zanya's super early just because of the presence of a Mordekaiser, then you've effectively rendered her useless, and it doesn't matter that Ornn is able to itemize extremely effectively against you. So I just want to point that out there, that even though it's a triple magic damage topside, the reality is that these champions cannot itemize magic resistance effectively without completely gutting their entire reason for being picked. So these types of things I just want to talk about. You could also do stuff like Lilia top lane. In a spot like this, you could do Kayle. Kayle would be really free in a spot like this and would effectively do the same thing. You could also do Ornn in a spot like this. Ornn would be really fine. You could also do Darius, although I wouldn't really recommend Darius. Actually, no, never mind. You can't really do Darius in a spot like this one. Ivern would be another possibility. I think Roaming Janna top lane is just really, really, really good. Another thing to point out is that this team composition is extremely immobile. And so I think that like champions like Camille with the ability to just push and shove, it is really good. These types of things are all just, you know, things that should be considered. There's a lot of other top laners that we could continue to like look at, and again, you know, there's just very limited options for what the opponents could do. You could do top Corki in a spot like this one, and there wouldn't be much for the opponents to do. You could do a very historic counter, which is like, you know, Kindred top lane, and there would be nothing for Ornn to do. Kindred is one of Ornn's like really good lane counters. Another champion that you could do in top lane that would be really effective would be Nasus, because of his value against Vi, Zeri, and Ashe, because Nasus would basically go completely untouched in this game, and it would be impossible to kill him in the later stages of the game. His Wither would have a lot of value. You know, I mean, Nasus being farmed up in a game like this would just be an utter disaster for the opponents. So there's so many options on R5 that could just be picked that completely render Fnatic's comp useless, and this is just really showing how they have absolutely no idea what they're drafting. They don't even know how to draft. They don't even probably know what day of the week it is. Probably don't even spell Fnatic. They actually probably spell it the way that the word Fnatic is actually spelled. So that is it for the mini draft kingdom of Fnatic's absolutely useless draft skill. And I hope that you enjoyed it, because I did not enjoy watching it. And yeah, I mean, Vitality just absolutely annihilated them in the draft phase. Whether or not Vitality was thinking about anything that was going on, I actually don't think that's the case, because again, they open R1, R2, Gragas, Xayah. This is punishable with the opening that Fnatic went for, but then Fnatic blunders B2, B3, effectively rewarding the R1, R2 of Vitality. And we already talked about some of the ways that Fnatic can get a lead on, I don't know what that was. We already talked about the ways that Fnatic can get a lead on B2, B3 inside of the draft, and then retain some flex options while also responding to what Vitality was doing on R1, R2. But they didn't do any of that, so that is pretty much it. Anyways, yeah, that'll be on YouTube, probably on Clip's channel or something. You guys can see it there.